Hello, I'm Meg Blanchett with O'Reilly Media, and I'm here with Dani Nordin, who is an independent UX designer and teacher for Drupal. What are some of the common pitfalls that Drupal designers fall into?
Oh, goodness. Well, the biggest problem that Drupal designers tend to have is understanding how to take their design and turn it into something that can work with Drupal. So part of that is what we call the theme layer, which is the set of PHP and HTML templates that creates the look and feel of your site. Part of that is understanding the basics of how Drupal builds things and how Drupal puts things on a page and how you can modify things within Drupal itself to give you the code that you want to style, to give you the look and feel that you're going for, or at least the basic layout that you're going for. Sometimes what happens is designers come up with this grand vision and present it to the developer, and the developer says, wow, that's fantastic, but it can't possibly happen in Drupal. And one of the things that I tried to do with my books, the Drupal for Designers series and the larger print edition, was help designers understand how Drupal works so you can know how to design for it. And to work with the system rather than against the system and still be able to create really good design. So there's two layers to that, obviously. One is the actual visual design, which is the fonts, the colors, the general look and feel elements. But then there's also the theme layer. How do we turn this into code that actually works on the system? Then there's a third layer, which is the layer that I tend to focus on now, which is actually the user experience and information architecture. That's something that combines both the theme layer and the visual design layer with an overall sense of the architecture of this thing we're building, a sense of how things are organized, a sense of how the user's actually going to find things. That piece of the puzzle, I think, the UX and information architecture piece, is the piece that visual designers that come into Drupal often get stymied by. Because the visual designers often, if they've built web pages before, they're used to this relatively easy way of coding things. When you get into Drupal, you actually have to think about the UX and the architecture and, how does the menu work before you can even write a line of code. So it's a multi-layered issue, but the benefit to that is it really broadens your perspective as a designer. It makes you much better as a designer and much better as a member of a team when you can actually speak the language of Drupal and understand how all of these moving parts fit together. It makes you better and more efficient at being a designer for the system, and it really makes your experience being on a team much better.
Do you have some go-to pieces of advice that you give to designers to kind of get around those issues?
The biggest thing is work with the system, not against it. It's kind of like, I always use this recipe metaphor. My business for a very long time was called the Zen Kitchen. And that's because I'm a foodie and a cook, and I tend to think in food metaphors. But I always think about it as, once you know the ingredients, once you know the base recipe, you can modify it so much. So the analogy I think of is this yogurt cake. It's one of the first recipes that French kids learn when they're like 2 or 3 years old. And it starts with yogurt, eggs, some baking powder, some flour, a little bit of vanilla, and that's it. And then you put it all together and you bake it. Once you know that basic recipe and you know what the basic amounts are, you can start playing with it. What happens if I use eggs instead of applesauce instead of eggs? Oh, it's really much better. So now it's yogurt, applesauce, flour. Drupal is the same way. you discover certain modules that you go to again and again, a certain base set of configurations that you go to again and again and again, and you start building in your head this mental checklist of how I'm going to start a project. You start building files, visual design elements. You start coming up with ways to make the system of visual design more efficient. You start developing this one base theme that you use over and over again, and you just adjust it for every product, for every project. So every project can still be different and have their own different needs, but you've always got that same base recipe to add on to.
So what's your big project right now with Drupal?
Too many of them. The big Drupal project that I'm working on right now is with Berklee College of Music. I'm working with the digital strategy and development team over there on this big project that basically takes two older systems that the campus, that members of the campus used to do their business with the college, into one unified framework within the existing .edu site, which is built in Drupal 7. So a lot of the work I'm doing is gathering requirements from different stakeholders, doing user interviews, doing information architecture, doing a little bit of visual design, but more making recommendations as to how we need to move forward in this specific way if we're going to make this thing scalable and sustainable over time. So that's my big Drupal project. The other pieces of my copious free time are teaching user experience design at General Assembly in Cambridge. I also occasionally teach UX design, fireworks, and general web design at Center for Digital Imaging Arts in Waltham. The other big thing that I'm working on is helping to organize the Design for Drupal camp that happens in Boston every June. That's going to be happening June 22nd and 23rd of this year. And I'm running the web team and the branding team. We're in the middle of getting the website up and running. And the other thing, because I always have too much on my plate, is I have a 6-month-old daughter named Charlotte, who I love very much, and who keeps me balanced.
So what is the focus for this year's Design for Drupal Boston?
The specific focus, the thing that we've been working on this year is really turning Design for Drupal into a design camp for Drupal. So sometimes what happens, because we are the only big Drupal event that happens in Boston every year, there is a tendency to have a lot of developer sessions, a lot of, turn it into a Drupal camp. And one of the things that we're really pushing for is to get more sessions that are very specifically geared towards design, user experience, theming, some site building, but really keep the focus on what can web designers do to make their lives in the Drupal community easier and to get their voices heard. And what are some sort of tricks of the trade, as it were, that we can share amongst each other to make our lives easier. So that's the big focus this year. The way that we're making that happen is by being more selective about the sessions that we solicit from people. I'm reaching out to a few designers that I know in the community to get some totally design focused, not Drupal focused sessions. Generally about being a web designer and UX and a couple of other things. The other thing that we're doing is we're actually including in the guidelines for session submission what we're looking for, so that it's much more clear that this is really a design camp that relates to Drupal rather than a more general Drupal camp.
So to wrap up, how do you see Drupal design changing with Drupal 8 coming out?
So I don't even know when Drupal 8 is coming out, but I'm guessing it probably won't be until sometime next year. Every time there's a major release, things change for designers. With Drupal 7, what we saw was a very different content editing experience, a very different site management experience. But we also saw differences in how we called things in the theme layer. So a lot of people had to relearn how to turn their Drupal designs into Drupal templates. I expect that that will continue to change as we transition into Drupal 8. My hope is that things will be a little simpler. I don't necessarily know that we can expect that. We do know, however, that there is a big push towards mobile first in Drupal 8, so that will require some more advanced thinking than some web designers are comfortable with. We're still just starting with the mobile first mindset in the Drupal community and in the broader design community. We all know that it needs to happen, but it's really difficult to sell that idea to stakeholders, especially when they want to throw an ad everywhere they see, to sort of get them focused on this tiny little screen, and then what happens as you make it bigger can be a tough sell for a lot of designers. So that's one piece of it. The other piece that I see being very interesting is the content editing experience, which is a big push in Drupal 8. There's talk of Spark, which is an entirely new way of managing content as a content editor, being in Drupal 8 core. There's a usability initiative. There's an HTML5 initiative. It's going to be very interesting to see how all of these different things play out and how they impact the visual designer and site themers experience within the Drupal community. From the UX designer's perspective, from the information architect's perspective, I think things have gotten a lot better. We are definitely, more and more clients are understanding why it's important to have UX designers on their team and how all of this relates to Drupal, especially for larger projects. I expect that's going to get even more so as we get into Drupal 8. As far as the visual designers, my only hope is that things continue getting easier and that the community continues to embrace designers for what they can bring to the team. And I think the more designers we have who can speak intelligently to developers about how Drupal works and what Drupal can do, and who can actually go to their team member and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. How might this work? Are there any things that I'm missing here? The better the community as a whole is going to be.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us today.
No problem. Glad to be here.